The Apache warrior had always known that his enemies would not grant him a clean death. A warrior's end, on the battlefield, was honorable. A knife to the chest, an arrow loosed in the heat of combat, or even a rifle's cold crack. These were deaths his ancestors would accept. But what had been done to him tonight was no death of warriors. It was humiliation, and it burned more deeply than the ropes cutting into his wrists. They had captured him at dawn, a dozen men who wore the dust of the frontier and the arrogance of conquerors. He had been scouting alone, far from his people, when rifles surrounded him. His knife had been quick, his will fierce, but no man can fight against so many barrels pointed at his chest. They had struck him, beaten him until his vision blurred, then bound his arms tight with coarse hemp rope. Still, his back had remained straight, his gaze unyielding. His silence, as they jeered at him, was the last weapon he possessed. "Let the wolves finish him," one of the settlers had spat, after arguing whether they should hang him or shoot him on the spot. "Why waste good lead on a savage? Tie him to a tree. Let the wild take him." They dragged him to a clearing where a dead pine stood like a skeleton against the twilight sky. The sun sank, staining the clouds blood red, as though mocking his fate. They pulled the ropes tighter, winding them cruelly across his chest and arms until the bark dug into his skin. Then, laughing, they left. Their horses carried them away, but not before one of them paused to sneer, "By morning, there'll be nothing left of you but bones." Silence settled, broken only by the whisper of wind in the branches. The Apache tested the ropes, strong, unyielding. His wrists were raw, blood already seeping beneath the fibers. He tried shifting his weight, hoping to loosen the knots, but the men had been clever. Every movement only tightened the cords, digging deeper, until he could feel the tree's rough skin scrape his back. Night came quickly in the wilderness. With it came the chorus of beasts. First, the distant yipping of coyotes, then the longer, mournful cry of wolves. Closer now. They smelled weakness, smelled blood. He had hunted wolves himself and knew how they circled, how patient they were. They would test him, prowl around him, until his exhaustion betrayed him. The forest seemed alive with eyes. He could feel them watching, glinting from the shadows. An owl swept silently overhead, a bad omen in his people's stories. His breath was steady, but deep inside something twisted. Was this truly to be his end? Not in battle, not with honor, but torn apart like prey. He lifted his chin, forcing his spirit to remain unbroken. If he must die, he would die staring into the dark without fear. But in the silence between wolf cries, another sound stirred. Hoofbeats, faint and hesitant, not the clatter of a band, but the measured pace of one rider. Hope flickered, though he crushed it quickly. Another settler, perhaps, come to gloat, or a hunter who might put a bullet in him just to boast of it. Yet the sound drew closer, the rhythm sharp, purposeful. He strained his eyes through the dark, waiting. The beasts closed in. He could hear the padding of paws now, low growls circling the clearing. His muscles tensed, though he could not move, his heart quickening as shadows shifted among the trees. He braced for the snap of jaws, the sting of teeth, and then the sharp click of a rifle being cocked, a single deliberate sound that cut through the night like lightning. The wolves hesitated, their yellow eyes gleaming. The Apache lifted his head toward the sound. Somewhere in the darkness, unseen but close, another fate was waiting. Sarah Whitfield had learned long ago that the frontier was no place for softness. Softness got you killed, or worse, robbed of everything you loved, until nothing was left but ashes in the wind. 3 years had passed since she buried her husband beneath the stony earth behind their cabin, and in that time she had become hunter, builder, and protector. The rifle slung across her back was not just a weapon, it was survival, and it was the only reason her little boy, Samuel, still breathed each morning. She did not hunt for sport. Every bullet meant something, Food on the table, a coat stitched from hides, bones boiled into broth to keep her child warm through the winter. And so, when she slipped through the forest that night, rifle raised, she wasn't chasing glory. She was chasing meat. Rabbits had grown scarce. Deer tracks led her deeper into the pines than she'd ever dared to go alone. The forest was restless. The air smelled of smoke and blood, though no fire burned. An owl gave a long, low cry, and Sarah froze, her grip tightening on the rifle. She had learned to trust the signs of the wild. They had kept her alive after her husband's death, when neighbors whispered she'd never manage on her own. But she had managed. Somehow, she always managed. Her boots pressed soft into the earth as she moved, listening. The wind carried sounds, a rustling, too heavy for a rabbit, too deliberate for deer. She crouched low behind a fallen log, heart thudding. Then came the sound that set her blood cold. Wolves. Their cries rose and fell, not far off, too close for comfort. She should have turned back. Samuel was waiting at home, and she had promised she would return before the fire burned out. But something held her fast. The sound beneath the wolves. Cries. A voice. Human. At first she thought it was the echo of her own mind, some trick of the wind. But no. The voice rose again, hoarse, defiant, carrying words she didn't understand. The cadence was strange, but the desperation in it was unmistakable. Her instinct screamed at her to stay out of it. Settler business, perhaps. Or worse, tribal. The wars between whites and Apache had left scars on both sides, and she had no intention of stepping into that blood feud. She wanted only peace, a small circle of safety around her boy, and yet, she heard the sound again. This time, a growl of wolves answered it, closer than before. Her finger brushed the trigger of her rifle without thinking. She had seen what wolves did to livestock, how quickly they stripped flesh to bone. To leave a man tied in their path was no death. It was cruelty. Sarah rose slowly, inching forward, her eyes adjusting to the night. Through the tangle of branches, she saw movement. A tall figure, bound against a tree, shoulders straight despite the ropes that cut into his flesh. His skin caught the pale moonlight, bronzed, not pale like the settlers she knew. His hair fell, long, wild, black as midnight, and his eyes, even from where she crouched, burned like coals in the darkness. An Apache. Her breath caught. She knew enough of frontier whispers to understand what that meant. The settlers hated them, feared them. She had heard stories of raids, of blood spilled at dawn. Yet what she saw before her was not a warrior on the attack. It was a man abandoned to die in the cruelest way. The wolves prowled closer, yellow eyes, circling the edge of the clearing. Sarah raised her rifle, steadying her breath. She had only one shot before the pack scattered and regrouped. One shot to change the outcome of what she was seeing. Her heart warred within her chest. If she pulled the trigger, she was no longer just a widow trying to survive. She would be a woman who had taken sides. She would draw the wrath of settlers who believed the Apache deserved only death. She would risk her son's safety for the life of a man who might kill her the moment she cut him free. And yet, when the largest wolf lunged from the brush, jaws snapping toward the bound man, her body decided for her. The rifle cracked like thunder in the night. The wolf tumbled lifeless into the dirt, and the rest of the pack froze. The Apache's eyes snapped toward her hiding place, burning with shock and something unspoken. Sarah exhaled slowly, lowering the smoking barrel. The die was cast. For a long, breathless moment, the clearing held stillness. The wolves hovered at the tree line, their yellow eyes gleaming in the dark, weighing whether to strike again or scatter. Sarah stood half-hidden behind a tangle of branches, her rifle still raised, the smoke drifting from its barrel curling into the night air. She had revealed herself now, whether she had wanted to or not. The man against the tree did not move. His chest rose and fell with the weight of exhaustion, but his gaze, dark, sharp, unbroken, never left her. Even from the shadows she could feel the weight of his stare pressing against her skin, not in threat, but in something deeper, something that demanded she face him, even though every instinct screamed to flee. The wolves began to circle wider. Their hunger had not vanished. Her bullet had only startled them. Low growls rippled through the underbrush as they prowled restlessly, waiting for an opening. They were patient killers, and the man was still bound, still helpless. One rifle. Shot would not save him for long. Sarah's breath quickened. She could turn back now, slip silently into the night, return to her cabin and pretend she had seen nothing. That was the safe choice. The choice that kept her boy fed. The choice that kept neighbors' suspicions from turning against her. But her hands would not lower the rifle. Her boots refused to retreat. She crept closer, her eyes never leaving the wolves. The Apache's head turned slightly, tracking her, his expression unreadable. He did not call out, did not beg. If anything, his silence unnerved her more than words could have. He stood proud even in his captivity, bound to the tree like a king chained to his throne. The first wolf broke from the line, lunging forward with a snarl. Sarah's rifle barked again, the shot ringing loud in the wilderness. The wolf spun and dropped lifelessly into the dirt. The pack scattered back, whining, retreating a few paces, but she knew it was temporary. They would not give up so easily. She cursed under her breath and glanced toward the Apache. The moonlight revealed the harsh ropes that cut across his arms and chest, blood streaking down his skin where the fibers had bitten deep. He remained impossibly still, as though any movement might shatter the fragile thread holding back the wolves. His eyes met hers again, steady, unreadable, and for the first time she wondered if he thought she was another enemy come to torment him. Her pulse hammered. She had fought men before, drunken settlers who thought a widow was easy prey, but she had never stood before someone like him. Even wounded and bound, he radiated strength. If she cut him free, what then? Would he turn on her? Would he vanish into the forest, leaving her to explain to her neighbors why she had saved an enemy of their kind? The growls rose again. Wolves crept closer, their bodies low to the earth, their patience thinning. She could not hesitate much longer. Sarah stepped fully into the clearing, her rifle raised, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Hold. I'm still," she whispered, though she knew he might not understand. His gaze flickered over her, searching, questioning. Then, for the first time, a faint nod. It was not submission. It was trust, or at least the smallest sliver of it. Enough to steady her trembling hands. She lifted the rifle again, sighting the closest wolf. The beasts froze at the sudden, sharp sound of the weapon cocking. Behind her, she heard the Apache inhale slowly, a warrior's breath, preparing for whatever came next. The forest seemed to hold its breath with them. One woman with a rifle, one man bound by rope, and a circle of hungry eyes waiting for the first mistake. The night exploded with a crack of thunder. Sarah's rifle spat fire again, and another wolf fell mid-leap, tumbling into the dirt with a yelp that silenced the rest of the pack for a heartbeat. Then chaos broke loose. Snarls erupted from every side of the clearing. Yellow eyes darted in the dark, fangs flashing as the pack lost patience. They had smelled blood long enough. Now hunger drove them mad. Sarah's hands trembled as she reloaded, fumbling with powder and ball. Her fingers were stiff in the chill night air, and every second she wasted was another chance for the wolves to rush. Her breath came quick and shallow. She had hunted deer, she had shot coyotes raiding her chickens, but never had she faced a pack like this, circling, closing in, waiting for her to falter. And through it all, the Apache stood bound against the tree. His eyes fixed on her with unflinching calm. He did not shout, did not struggle, though the beasts snapped so close she could see their teeth glisten. It was as though he had surrendered his fate entirely into her hands. That silent trust cut deeper than any plea for help could have. The wolves lunged again. Sarah raised the rifle, but she was too slow this time. A gray shadow leapt for the bound man, jaws wide. Instinct moved her before thought. She fired, the bullet splitting the beast's skull an instant before it tore into him. The wolf collapsed at his feet, and the smell of blood grew heavier in the air. The pack faltered, whining and pacing, uncertain now. 3 of their number lay dead. The forest echoed with their frustration as they melted back into the shadows, yelps and growls, trailing into the distance. For now, the danger had passed. Sarah lowered her rifle, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Smoke curled from the muzzle, mingling with her quick, ragged breath. She glanced at the man, still bound, still impossibly silent, his dark eyes locked on hers. In that gaze, she read something she could not name: pride, relief, perhaps even gratitude. But also a fierce question. Why? Why had she intervened? Why risk her life for a man her own neighbors would have left to die? Sarah swallowed hard, her thoughts racing. She had not planned this, had not thought past the moment her finger squeezed the trigger. But now the choice was before her, sharp as a knife's edge. Walk away, leaving him bound for the next pack of beasts. Or cut him free and face the consequences. She stepped closer. The ropes were thick, knotted cruelly into the bark. She reached for the knife at her belt but paused, her hand hovering in midair. Releasing him could mean danger. She was a woman, alone but for her child, and this man, this warrior, was everything her neighbors had warned her to fear. Yet when she looked into his eyes again, she saw no malice there. Only dignity, worn but unbroken. A man who had faced death and refused to bow. Her knife flashed in the moonlight as she drew it. The blade sliced through the first rope, fibers snapping with a sound like breaking bones. His chest heaved as air rushed into his lungs more freely. She cut another, and his arm dropped heavy at his side, blood rushing back into the numbed limb. For the first time he spoke, soft, low, in a tongue she did not know. The words were foreign, but the tone carried weight, like a prayer offered to the night sky. Sarah hesitated. She had crossed a line now. She had chosen his life over her safety, over the expectations of every settler who called her a neighbor. There would be no turning back. With one final stroke, the last rope fell. Away! The Apache staggered forward, catching himself against the tree, free at last. He lifted his head, and for the first time his expression broke. Not into a smile, not into anger, but into something raw, a flicker of awe and disbelief. Sarah lowered, her knife, her rifle hanging loose at her side. She had no words to explain what she had done, only the echo of her bullet still ringing in the trees, the shot that had saved his life and bound hers to his. The last rope slid to the ground, and the Apache swayed forward, his weight buckling beneath him. Sarah's hands moved before her mind could stop them. She caught his arm, steadying him against her shoulder. The heat of his body shocked her, the raw strength beneath his skin, the tremor of exhaustion that betrayed how close he had come to death. For a moment, their eyes met in the silver wash of moonlight. Hers were wide with uncertainty. His burned with the fierce pride of a man who hated to lean on anyone, least of all a stranger. Yet he did not pull away. He simply let the moment hang, a silent acknowledgement of the thin thread of trust that now bound them together. Sarah knew the sensible choice. Walk away. Leave him here, now that the wolves had scattered. Her neighbors would never forgive her if they discovered what she had done. Some might even turn violent. And she had her son to think of. Samuel, sleeping in their cabin, innocent, to the dangers that lurked in the world. But when she released her grip, the Apache's knees buckled. He caught himself with one hand against the tree, teeth clenched, breath ragged. The ropes had carved raw wounds into his skin, blood streaking down his arms. His strength had carried him this far, but it was fading quickly. If she abandoned him now, the forest would finish what the settlers had begun. Her jaw tightened. She told herself it wasn't about pity, it was about fairness, about decency. No man deserved to be left for beasts, not even one who might call her his enemy. "Come on," she murmured, her voice steady though her heart raced. "You'll die out here." She slipped under his arm, guiding him to lean against her as they began the slow walk through the trees. He was taller than she expected, his weight heavy on her shoulders. But she did not falter. Each step was a battle. The undergrowth snagged her skirts, roots caught her boots, and his labored breathing pressed against her ear like the rasp of a saw. The forest seemed endless. Every crack of a branch sent her nerves on edge, expecting wolves to return, or worse, settlers. If anyone saw her now, half carrying an Apache through the night, there would be no explaining it away. She could already hear the whispers. The widow Whitfield has lost her mind. She's harboring a savage. But she pushed the thoughts aside and focused on each step forward. At last, the faint outline of her cabin appeared through the trees, a shadow against the star-swept sky. Relief swelled in her chest, though it was tinged with dread. She was crossing a line she could never uncross. She eased him inside, careful not to wake Samuel, whose small form lay curled beneath a quilt on the cot. The Apache's weight sank onto the chair by the hearth, his head dropping back, his breath ragged. The firelight revealed the full extent of his injuries, the rope burns, the bruises, the dried blood that streaked across his chest. Sarah sat down her rifle, her hands already moving to fetch water and cloth. She knelt before him, dipping the rag into the basin, and pressed it gently against his wounds. He flinched, but did not resist. His dark eyes followed her every movement, sharp and unreadable. She wondered what he thought of her, this frontier widow with rough hands and tired eyes, who had cut him free when no one else would. Did he see weakness? Did he see kindness? Or did he simply see another soul trapped between survival and ruin as he was? When she met his gaze again, she felt the weight of the choice she had made settled deep in her bones. She had brought him into her home. She had taken responsibility for his life, and in doing so, she had tied her own fate to his. The cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the shallow rasp of the Apache's breathing. Sarah moved carefully, dabbing his wounds with a damp cloth, her touch firm but not cruel. Each time the rag pressed against torn skin, he flinched, though he made no sound. His silence unsettled her more than groans of pain might have. It was the silence of endurance, of a man who had learned never to show weakness before an enemy, but she was no enemy. At least she didn't think she was. Her boy stirred in his sleep on the cot by the far wall, a soft sigh muffled beneath the quilt. Sarah glanced at him, her heart tightening. Samuel was too young to understand what she was doing, too young to see that the man in their home was one her neighbors would call an enemy, one they would punish her for sheltering. She would have to explain later, but for now, secrecy was safety. The Apache's eyes tracked her every movement. In the glow of firelight, his gaze softened, though it never lost its sharpness. He watched her as though weighing her soul, judging if her kindness was genuine or a trick. She tried not to meet his eyes for too long, yet each time she did, something passed between them, something wordless and heavy. "Hold still," she whispered, as she bound a strip of linen around his wrist. The words were habit, though she knew. He likely didn't understand, yet somehow he did not need to. Her tone carried enough. When she finished tending to his wounds, she sat back, wiping sweat from her brow. The silence pressed thick between them, filled only by the fire's low roar. She thought of speaking, asking his name, why those men had left him for dead. but the questions caught in her throat. Language stood between them like a wall. Still, she sensed that even if they shared a tongue, words would not come easily. His kind of man spoke less with his mouth and more with his eyes, his posture, his silence. So she studied that silence. When she rose to fetch bread from the cupboard, his eyes followed her with cautious interest. She tore a piece, setting it before him. For a long moment he stared at it, suspicion shadowing his features. Then with a measured hand he took it. His fingers brushed hers briefly, rough against her calloused skin. No words were exchanged, but something passed in that touch, a flicker of understanding, of shared survival. He ate slowly, deliberately, never turning his back on her or the room. She recognized the behavior. It was the way she herself had learned to live since her husband's death. Always wary, always ready for danger. In him, she saw a reflection of herself, a survivor who trusted no one, yet had accepted her aid because survival left no other choice. Later, when Samuel whimpered in his sleep, Sarah rose to soothe him, pulling the quilt tighter around his small frame. When she glanced back, she found the Apache watching, not with threat, not with coldness, but with a strange, distant softness. The sight of her child seemed to stir something in him, though his expression remained unreadable. Their eyes met, across the room. No words, no gestures, only firelight and silence. And yet Sarah felt as though they had spoken volumes. She realized then that language was not only words. It was the way he straightened when she moved near, the way his eyes softened when she offered food, the way his silence shifted from guarded to something closer to respect. It was the language of survival, of unspoken trust. And in that silence, fragile but growing, a bond had begun to form. The morning sun broke across the frontier like fire spilling over the horizon. Sarah stood at the doorway of her cabin, the chill air biting her cheeks. She carried the pail toward the well, her eyes flicking back to the cabin every few steps. Inside, the Apache rested by the hearth, his wounds bound, his body still recovering from the night's ordeal. She had left him with bread and water, hoping he would remain quiet while she faced the day. But neighbors had sharp eyes, and rumors traveled faster than the wind. "Morning, Widow Whitfield." The voice jolted her. She looked up to see Henry, Rourke, a man with a permanent sneer carved into his face, leaning against his horse at the edge of her property. He was one of the men who liked to remind her she was alone out here, always circling like a vulture, waiting for her to stumble. "Morning," she replied curtly, lowering the bucket into the well. "Seeing tracks near your place," Henry said, tipping his hat though his eyes narrowed. "Boot prints. Not yours. Not your boys either. Big prints. Fresh." Her heart thudded. She kept her hands steady, pulling the bucket back up with slow precision. "I was hunting last night," she lied. "Could have been me." Henry chuckled low, a sound that made her skin crawl. "Maybe. Or maybe you've got company. Ain't wise bringing strangers out this way. Dangerous times." She forced a thin smile. "The only company I keep is my boy." Henry's eyes lingered on her, sharp and probing. Then he spat into the dirt. "Best keep it that way. Folks talk, you know. They see tracks, hear shots in the woods at night. Well, they start asking questions." With that, he swung into his saddle and rode off, dust rising in his wake. Sarah stood rigid, the bucket heavy in her hands, her pulse hammering. He knew something, or at least he suspected, and suspicion was just as dangerous as proof. When she returned inside, she found the Apache watching her with quiet intensity. He had not moved much, but his eyes told her he had heard everything. His silence was no longer just the silence of mistrust. It was the silence of a man who understood the danger pressing in around them. She set the bucket down and met his gaze. "They'll come looking," she murmured half to herself. "They'll come, And if they find you here? Her words faltered. She didn't need to finish the thought. The settlers who tied him to that tree would not hesitate to kill her for helping him. They'd call her a traitor, a woman who had betrayed her kind. The Apache's jaw tightened. Slowly, with effort, he pushed himself to his feet. Though still weakened, he stood tall, his presence filling the small cabin. He touched his chest lightly, then gestured toward the door, as if to say, "I should go." But the image of him collapsing in the woods, prey for wolves or settlers, struck her hard. She shook her head firmly. "No, not yet. You wouldn't make it. A mile." He studied her, then gave the smallest nod. Again, no words were exchanged, yet the understanding was clear. She had chosen to keep him here, to shelter him, and in doing so, she had chosen the path of danger. That night, as Samuel slept, soundly Sarah sat by the fire staring into the flames. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls, carrying with it the faintest echo of horses in the distance. She did not know if it was real or imagined, but she felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her home. The settlers were watching, waiting, and, if they learned the truth, the bullet that had saved the Apache's life might yet spell her ruin. The days that followed were a fragile balance between fear and necessity. Sarah went about her chores with a nervous edge, always glancing at the tree line, always expecting a neighbor's face to appear, demanding answers she could not give. Inside the cabin, the Apache's strength slowly returned. The firelight, no longer showed the hollow exhaustion in his eyes, and though the wounds still marked his body, the set of his shoulders told her he was a man not easily broken. She thought he would leave as soon as he could walk, yet he stayed. Not with words, he had few she could understand, but with action. One morning she found him outside, barefoot in the dirt, working silently to mend the fence that had been leaning for weeks. She froze at the door, surprised. He had taken her. Hatchet, splitting rails with sharp, efficient strikes, his movements fluid and sure. He didn't glance at her, didn't ask permission. He simply worked, as though the task was owed. Sarah's first instinct was caution. What if the neighbors saw? What if his presence was discovered? But then she watched her fence rise straighter under his hands, stronger than she could have, managed alone, and something inside her softened. This was no enemy's act. This was repayment. In the evenings, when Samuel played near the hearth, the Apache began to show Sarah things without words. He picked up her rifle one night, not to use it, but to demonstrate. He mimed her stance, then shook his head. Taking her hands, he adjusted the way she gripped the stock, shifted her feet wider. His touch was firm but respectful, guiding rather than commanding. When she raised the rifle again, the sight aligned more steady than it ever had. She exhaled, lowering the weapon, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're a teacher, then?" she asked softly. He didn't reply in words, but the faintest curve of his mouth told her enough. Over the next days, he taught her more. How to read the forest, not just with eyes, but with ears and nose. How the crack of a twig spoke of weight. How the shift of birds told of danger long before it reached the ground. He showed her snares for rabbits, knots that held strong, ways to move silently over leaf-littered ground. Sarah learned quickly, driven not only by need, but by the strange bond that grew between them. Each lesson was a language of its own, his, hand steadying hers, his eyes meeting hers to confirm understanding. They did not need shared words. Their silence spoke louder. Samuel, too, watched with wide-eyed fascination. He had been shy of the Apache at first, clinging to his mother's skirts. But one evening the warrior sat on the floor and, with patient fingers, carved a small horse from a scrap of wood. He handed it to the boy without a word. Samuel's eyes lit up, and from then on, the fear melted. To him, the man was no longer a stranger, but a protector. Yet even as this quiet trust grew, Sarah felt the shadow of danger looming. The settlers had not forgotten. She heard whispers at the trading post. Wolves shot near her land, strange tracks seen by hunters. Henry Rourke's name surfaced often, his voice dripping suspicion. Still, when she returned home each evening and saw the Apache tending the fire, or hear Samuel's laughter as he played with his wooden horse, a strange calm settled over her. She had saved his life. And now, in his own way, he was saving hers, teaching her to stand stronger, to live sharper. It was not just honor that kept him by her side. She began to see it in the way his gaze lingered, in the unspoken weight that passed between them when their hands brushed. Respect had taken root. And from respect, something deeper stirred, something neither of them dared name yet. For in a land where survival was the only law, honor was the first seed of trust. The night was quiet, too quiet, the kind of stillness that presses against the skin, warning of a storm not yet seen. Sarah sat by the fire, stitching a tear in Samuel's shirt, her needle trembling slightly, though she told herself it was only from weariness. Across the room, the Apache sharpened his knife with slow, deliberate strokes, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel echoing in the hush. Then came the sound. Horses, faint at first, but growing. More than one, moving fast. Sarah froze, the cloth slipping from her hands. The Apache's head lifted, his eyes narrowing, every sense alert. He stood, knife poised, listening with the instinct of a man who had lived his whole life on the edge of danger. The horses stopped, not far from the cabin. Then voices, rough, mocking, familiar. Henry Rourke. Sarah's stomach dropped. She didn't need to hear the words to know why they had come. They had followed the trail, pieced together the whispers. And now they were here to finish what the wolves could not. The Apache moved silently to the door, crouching low to peer through a crack in the shutters. His jaw tightened. He turned to her, gesturing sharply. "Get the boy. Hide him." Her heart pounded. She scooped Samuel from the cot, pressing a finger to his lips as his sleepy eyes blinked in confusion. She led him to the small root cellar beneath. The floorboards whispering fiercely, "Stay quiet no matter what." His little hands clutched her sleeve, but she pried free, lowering the trapdoor and covering it with a rug. By the time she turned, the Apache had already taken her rifle, checking the powder with practiced hands. He handed it to her without hesitation, keeping only his knife for himself. Their eyes met, no words. Only the understanding that tonight, survival bound them as tightly as any rope. The first torch sailed through the air, shattering against the side of the cabin. Flames licked up the wood, casting wild shadows. "Widow Whitfield!" Henry's voice roared from the darkness. "We know what you've done. Hand him over or burn with him." Sarah's blood ran cold, but her grip on the rifle tightened. The Apache moved to her side, his presence steady, grounding. She could feel the heat of him even without touch. Another torch. The roof groaned as sparks rained. Sarah's throat tightened. Her home, the only piece of her husband she had left, was being devoured by fire. But there was no time for grief. The door splintered under a heavy boot. Men poured inside, rifles gleaming in the firelight. The first shot was hers. The rifle cracked, smoke filling the cabin, and one of the intruders fell with a scream. Chaos erupted. The Apache lunged, silent as a shadow, his knife flashing. Another man staggered back, clutching his chest. They fought side by side, Sarah firing, reloading, her hands steady despite her racing heart. The Apache moved like the storm itself, swift, precise, merciless. Together they cut through the attackers, their bodies moving in unspoken rhythm, each covering the other as though they had done this for years. But the numbers were against them. More men circled outside, shouting, preparing to rush again. The flames spread, smoke choking the air. "Sarah." Henry's voice cut through the chaos, furious. "You'll hang for this! A traitor to your own!" She raised the rifle, aiming toward the doorway where his shadow loomed. But before she could fire, the Apache stepped forward, his body shielding. Hers, his eyes locked on the man outside. The fight was not finished. The fire roared higher, the cabin trembling around them, and in that moment, amid smoke, blood, and ruin, Sarah understood something with bone-deep certainty. Their fates were no longer separate. Whether they lived or died tonight, they would do so together. The dawn rose red, as if the sky itself bled for the night's violence. The cabin was nothing more than a smoldering skeleton, timbers blackened and collapsing inward, smoke curling into the pale morning air. Sarah stood at the edge of the ruins. Samuel clutched to her side, the boy's small body trembling though he tried to be brave. The Apache stood a few paces away, his bare chest streaked with soot and blood, some his own, most not. His knife hung loose at his side, the blade dulled by the night's work. He did not look at her at first. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, hard and unyielding, as though already planning the path ahead. Behind them, the ground was littered with the fallen. Henry Rourke among them, his sneer forever silenced. The surviving settlers had fled before dawn, too battered to finish what they started, but not too broken to spread word of what they'd seen. Sarah knew the cost of that truth. There would be no forgiveness for her now. Her home was gone. Her neighbors would call her a traitor, a woman who harbored an enemy and turned a rifle on her own kind. She could never go back to the settlement. Even if she tried, the stares, the whispers, the threats would follow her until the end. For the first time since her husband's death, Sarah felt untethered. She had clung to the cabin as though it were a lifeline, the last remnant of a past life. But now, with nothing left but ashes, she was free in the most terrifying way. Free to choose. The Apache finally turned his eyes on her. Dark, steady, unreadable. He gestured toward the forest, his hand cutting a silent path. He was offering her a way out, but not safety. The wilderness held its own dangers. To follow him meant leaving behind everything she had ever known. Her land, her language, her people. Samuel stirred against her, his voice small but firm. "Mama, we go with him." Her throat tightened. She looked at the boy, his wide eyes reflecting trust, not fear. He had already accepted the man who had saved them, who had carved him a wooden horse, who had fought like a storm to keep them alive. To Samuel, the Apache was not an enemy. He was a protector. Sarah lifted her chin, her gaze locking with the warrior's. Slowly she nodded. His expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. A quiet acknowledgement, perhaps, even respect. Without another word, he turned and began walking into the trees. Sarah took Samuel's hand and followed, each step carrying them deeper into the unknown. The forest swallowed them in its green shadows, cool and alive compared to the charred ruin behind. Birds called overhead, and the earth smelled of moss and promise. Sarah's heart pounded with every step, not with fear, but with a strange, fierce exhilaration. She was no longer bound to grief, to loneliness, to the small life others had carved for her. Now she walked beside a man whose silence spoke louder than any vow, a man who had every reason to hate her kind, yet had chosen to stand by her. Together they had survived fire, wolves, and the cruelty of men. Perhaps survival was enough. But deep inside, Sarah felt it was more. The land ahead was wild, unforgiving, and untamed, just like the bond that had taken root between them. It was not a love born of words, nor of gentle courtship. It was a love carved from fire and blood, from trust tested at the edge of death. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah glanced back one last time at the rising smoke in the distance. Then she turned away, stepping into the path the Apache had chosen. It was not an ending. It was a beginning, one written not in ashes, but in the living earth beneath their feet. And this time, she was not walking alone.